Good afternoon. Welcome. My name is Erin Corcoran, and I'm the executive director of the Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies at the University of Notre Dame. And I'm here today to introduce our discussion and panel entitled The Role of Business in Creating Common Ground: Music, Sports, Pets, and Other Cultural Artifacts as a Tool for Bridging Divides. And I think it's particularly fitting in the sense that have been in conversation with Dr. Fort for some time about his opportunities to come and speak here in the Notre Dame community, but it was through actually his work and putting together this panel that I got to meet and be introduced to Dr. Martin, who's a new professor here at Notre Dame at Mendoza. And so I just think it's great that even in the world of peace studies, we've got someone from afar sort of connecting me to some of the expertise and work of in the academics here at Notre Dame. So for the format for today, I'm going to briefly introduce both Tim Fort and Kirsten Martin, and then I'm going to hand over the presentation to Tim, and he's going to walk you through, and then Kirsten's going to respond, and then we're going to open it up for Q&A from the audience. And so you can submit your questions through the Q&A function on the Zoom. And then I'll be facilitating that Q&A after we hear the remarks and the response. So just a little bit about Professor Fort. He currently holds the Eveleigh Professorship of Business Ethics and is a professor of business law and ethics at the Kelley School of Business at Indiana University. And he is a double domer, received his BA and MA from the University of Notre Dame and his PhD and JD from Northwestern University. And he taught at the University of Michigan from 1994 to 2005, and then was at George Washington University in Washington, D.C. from 2005 to 2013. He's a prolific writer. He's written over 80 articles and 15 books, as well as editing an additional 23 textbooks, supplemental pedagogical books, and research volumes. Two of his books have won the Best Book Award from the Academy of Management for Social Issues, including his Stanford University Press book, The Diplomat in the Corner Office. He has won 12 research awards from 3 different academic associations: the Academy of Legal Studies and Business, and the Society for Business Ethics, and the Academy of Management, and has served on the editorial board of the flagship journals of each of these associations. He's also an incredible teacher and has won 5 teaching awards, and has served as the academic director for a unique program for players from the National Football League. And he also co-autors with then Federal Reserve Chair Ben Bernanke. And I could go on and on, but I also just wanted to say on a personal note, one of the things that I've really enjoyed about working with Professor Fort is his sort of commitment to the ways in which his work intersects with peace studies and business. And then briefly before I turn it over to him, I just wanted to also give you a little bit of background on Professor Martin, who is a new professor here at Notre Dame. And she is the William P. and Hazel B. White Center Professor of Technology Ethics. And even prior to coming to Notre Dame, she's a nationally recognized expert in privacy, technology, and corporate responsibility. And she joined the Notre Dame Technology Ethics Center in 2020. As a tenured appointment as a professor of information technology, analytics, and operations at Mendoza College of Business. And she is also a prolific writer and scholar, published numerous articles on privacies and the ethics of technology in leading academic journals, including the Journal of Business Ethics, the Harvard Journal of Law and Technology, the Journal of Legal Studies, Washington University Law Review, Journal of Business Research. She serves as the Technology and Business Ethics Editor for the Journal of Business Ethics, and she's also a member of the advisory board for the Future Privacy Forum. She's a fellow at the Business Roundtable Institute for Corporate Ethics and is a highly regarded expert speaker on issues including privacies and the ethics of big data. She earned her BS in engineering from the University of Michigan and her MBA and doctorate degree from the University of Virginia's Darden Graduate School of Business. And we're just really happy and fortunate to have both of them here today. And I look forward to this conversation. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Tim. Thank you.
Thank you, Erin, for that nice introduction. Thank you to all of you for being here today. And a special thanks to Kirsten, who is my old colleague, no, I shouldn't say that, my former colleague at George Washington University, where we worked together here about now 9-10 years ago or something like that. So let me get my screen sharing here for you. So to start this off, I've had it's special to be here. It's special to be at Notre Dame. It always is. As Aaron indicated, I'm a double domer. Even though was raised non-Catholic in a fairly anti-Catholic rural area of Western Illinois, Notre Dame was the only school that I applied to coming out of high school. The only one. I was totally smitten by the place and have continued to be for 45 years. And so my only regret today is that I'm not there. I'm having to do this by Zoom, but at the same time, I know it's snowing there. Not that that's unusual in South Bend, but maybe it's just as well to be in a nice warm environment, although we're going to get snow here in a little bit here today at Bloomington as well. I've got a lot I want to cover today, so I'm going to talk fast and I want to get into this right away. Let me give you a roadmap of what I'm looking at here for today. And I hope you don't mind to have the slides following along on the side. Frankly, it helps me keep track of where I'm going so I don't get lost myself. But I want to start off talking a little bit about business and peace itself. That's still a relatively young area, and so a lot of people don't know a lot about it, or if they do, they have some preconceptions of what it means, some of which may be accurate, but I want to kind of limit the kind of things that we're looking at here today so that you know what I'm talking about, which is a part of a field as opposed to the entire field. Then, for reasons that will become pretty clear, I want to talk about how cultural artifacts can affect the workplace, because I'm going to be making an argument that actually business ethics behavior and ethical corporate cultures themselves contribute to relatively nonviolent societies. And so understanding the workplace itself, I think, is important. And then I'll move to the final point in terms of how cultural artifacts can create common ground for people who otherwise might disagree with each other. So let me give you just a little bit of a brief history on business and peace. About 22 years or so ago, I was a professor, an assistant professor at the Michigan Business School, as Aaron indicated, and I was getting close to the time I was going up for tenure. But we were living in South Bend, and I would take this was before kids, but I would take the train, the Amtrak from Niles up to Ann Arbor, I'd leave on Monday night, do all my teaching, come back Thursday evening. And we did that for several years. My wife had a great job at the Center for the Homeless. We loved South Bend. It was really one of our favorite spots. And so I'm about ready to go up for tenure. I'm writing my first major book with Oxford University Press on ethics and governments, which was really focusing more on ethics and corporate culture. And since I was in South Bend, I spent a lot of time wandering around campus, going to the bookstore. And one of the places that I always stopped at the bookstore was to see what Kroc was featuring these days. And my PhD is in theology, and I'm kind of interested in this stuff, generally before it became my writing career. And I would just pull off things and buy things that the Kroc Institute was writing about or talking about or featuring that particular season. My dean at Michigan also did me the wonderful favor of the year before I was going up for tenure, giving me the assurances that it was going to work. He said, "Just don't worry about this. It's going to work. You're going to work out fine." So with all that coming into a mix, what I was finding was when I was doing my Oxford book on corporate culture and reading some of the stuff that it started with the Kroc Institute, I came across some articles and books of anthropologically determined attributes of relatively nonviolent societies. And I noticed that, gosh, there's a lot of overlap of what I'm talking about in corporate culture and the way these societies kind of operate. And that was kind of the aha moment where I said, maybe there's a connection between ethical business behavior and lessening the likelihood of violence. Then I got tenure, and I thought, well, what's a good tenure risk? I mean, let's take tenure seriously. It's not just job sinecure. I mean, what's the big gamble that you want to take? Where you're going to roll the dice and ask a question that really hasn't been asked an awful lot before and see where it goes. And so my answer was, I want to see if there is a relationship between ethical business behavior and peace. I was quickly told by colleagues around the country that I had completely lost my mind, that this was a career-ending move, that no one asks questions like that, and I should stop before I got started. But I was hooked. I was hooked on the idea that there is a relationship between organizational ethics and peaceful societies. And I looked at some of the research that I've been doing, or some of the methodology that I've been using, and a lot of it was based on the work of then a fairly prominent business ethicist who unfortunately passed away here a couple of years ago, Bill Frederick, who was using naturalistic models from biology, from the physical sciences, evolutionary biology, in order to try to capture three ways in which business ethics holds together: a kind of an economizing value, a power aggrandizing value, and a ecologizing value. And I was noticing that those kind of tripartite discussions also were mapping very well with some of the readings I was doing in the political theory aspect of peace studies of hard power, soft power, and sticky power. And so these were kind of coalescing. And when I was looking at the writing that I was doing in the books, I was writing about three kinds of trust as a way to build ethical culture. And I thought, this is the model that I'm looking at, that there's kind of three interacting sources that if you can get them into some degree of, if not balance, at least talking to each other, that you may be able to find a pathway for businesses in order to focus on peace. And I'll talk about that in just a little bit, in a little bit. And so we, with a colleague at the University of Michigan, Cindy Scapani, who bravely joined me in these wanderings, we had a couple of conferences, and then we wrote a book, and then I moved to George Washington University, which was a great place to be doing this kind of stuff. I mean, GW isn't just in the right city to do this kind of thinking, it's the right neighborhood in Foggy Bottom to be able to interact with all the agencies that are around you, including the US Institute of Peace. I co-led a task force on that, on business and peace, while I was there. And the field started to grow. I mean, before this, there was two or three other people that had started to write on business and peace. A lot of people have written about economic development and peace and trade and peace, but what about these business institutions, these human organizations, and what impact they might have? Now, over the last 22 years or so, there's been an enormous growth in this field. And it's worth pointing out this growth because sometimes I have found that people think of business in this really monolithic kind of a way. It's an institution of power, and so there's this thing called business that cranks out money, and that's about the extent to which we think of it. But there's a lot of different kinds of businesses, based on size and structure. There's multinational corporations, there's small and medium enterprises, there's nonprofit organizations, which is the kind of business. If you don't believe that a nonprofit organization is not a business, look at Indiana University or Notre Dame. Those are business entities. They practice business while they're also doing their other things as well. And so there are family businesses. There are all kinds of different businesses. They're not just one kind of a business, and they all have a little bit different kind of an interface that they might have with business and peace. There's also categories of business in terms of what kind of consequence they might have. Some are interested in helping make peace or peacekeeping. Others are more incremental peace builders. And so in some instances, maybe a business might be able to help maintain or broker a peace agreement. But in other cases, it may be much more amorphous, much more incremental, much less measurable, but still have a bigger cultural kind of an impact. I'm in that last category. I applaud and I cheer all of my colleagues who want to talk about how a particular business helped to resolve a conflict. I think that's great. It's not what I do. What I do is how business might be able to make incremental improvements in the way that human beings conduct themselves with each other. And by doing so, having a slow moving but still profound change on cultural attitudes toward business and outside of business as well. And so there are these subgenres within the field where you're looking at businesses that are involved in acute conflict. And so you'd have the example of Tom Friedman writing in the New York Times here 20 some years ago, more than that at this point, of how General Electric stepped in between India and Pakistan in order to try to get them to stand down on a nuclear standoff. Or you can look at it more of a regulatory body where what kind of business or governmental supports do we need to have in order to support business making peace? And you'd see work there from the Australian Joe Ford or the Norwegian Jason Miklian, or my former student at George Washington University, John Katzos, who's now at the University of American University at Sargé. Or again, you can have issues of cultural change. And so I want, as we go into this, I just want us to be aware of kind of there's different kinds of businesses, there are different kinds of roles that they might play, there are different kinds of reactions that people might have to it. So they're not monolithic. Now, my particular contribution that I made with Cindy Scapani is that we proposed 3 or 4, we never agreed, 3 or 4 different contributions that businesses can make to peace. And you'll see that these still track with that kind of a tripartite division that I was talking about. So there's rule of law, which goes along with a legal or a power aspect. terms of dispute resolution and avoidance of corruption. One study that we did, we showed a perfect correlation between those countries that are the most corrupt and those countries that resolve disputes by violence. And so there's a rule of law dimension to it. There's an economic aspect to it in terms of creation of employment opportunities, jobs for people, in terms of technological and managerial transfers, and also the differentiation of the economy away from commodities. Those countries that are their primary economic product is a commodity that can be mined and distributed are going to be prone, according to Paul Collier, more prone to civil war. Now, mind you, and I'm looking at this slide, there's four books that I've written on this slide, so I'm speeding through this really quickly, but I just want to give you a little bit of a flavor of this. And most importantly for me, although the rule of law is critical to me, is the kind of community interaction that businesses have. And one sense of community is an external dimension of corporate citizenship, being environmentally responsible, being respectful of local customs and things like that. To me, an even more interesting idea is how the business develops its workplace as being a kind of community itself, through giving people voice to be able to talk about how the job is affecting them. Not making this into a corporate democracy, but giving people the opportunity to speak about how their products and services are made, which is a principle of quality management. So I'm not talking about anything that's particularly bizarre. It's something that business leaders talk about anyway. In terms of gender equity, boy, you want to have a good correlation between what kind of countries that are peaceful or not. Gender equity is a good one to look at. And there's something that businesses can do about that. This is not just rarefied air. Businesses can do something in order to promote gender equity. And in terms of sizes of organizations, what really got me tenure at Michigan was a notion of what I call mediating institutions, that you have to put people, this follows from a combination of Catholic social thought and natural law, as well as empirical studies, that there are biological limits to the sizes of groups that people can live in so that they can see the consequences of their action. And if you put them in too big of a sizes, that they don't realize that have consequences of their action, and therefore they tend to not think of ethical conduct as seriously as they otherwise might. And so people putting people in the right sizes of organizations make a difference. And then there's track 2 diplomacy, which you all are aware of. Usually I have to go into a description of what that means. And I don't know how I feel about that yet. I mean, I'm not sure if I want to turn business over into the art of diplomacy or not. I was doing a presentation actually at Notre Dame 20 years ago. I used to interact with a lot of folks at Notre Dame. Carolyn Wu, the dean at Mendoza for a while, we talked a lot. She had Peace Through Commerce, and we talked a lot about the interaction. Lee Tavis and Ollie Williams were some of the early leaders on business and peace. And I was doing a presentation, and the person who was sitting next to me said, "Diplomacy is really tricky. Diplomacy is hard. You really want the business to be responsible for that?" And I took that to heart, that sometimes it might work, but I'm not sure of how much I want to rely on the business organizations to be that track 2 diplomat. Maybe jury's still out as far as I'm concerned on that. So that's just a quick background on business and peace. Now, I leave George Washington University 8 years ago and come here to Indiana University. And I'm thinking when I left, I mean, I had written 4 books at the time, and again, had interacted with all the folks in the Foggy Bottom area of DC. And I was wondering, well, maybe that part of my career is now over. But one of the great perks of being here is that we have the Jacobs School of Music here, which arguably is the finest school of music in the world. I mean, you obviously are going to have some arguments one way or the other, but it is awfully good. I will tell you that. And my children, my boys, were doing piano lessons. They were 6 and 9, I think, at the time. And I'm sitting outside of their rehearsal room on a Saturday morning, and it just dawned on me, why couldn't you use music as a way to nudge people to make some kinds of decisions rather than others? Music is powerful. It plays on our emotions. How could we use music in order to orient people's mindset to some kind of decisions over other kinds of decisions? And that started the next round, where I've worked and done several conferences. We have a book coming out with the Jacobs School of Music, and also worked with the IU Cinema. And the premise here is that interacting with cultural artifacts, such as music, sports, movies, even our dogs, and cats too. I'm a dog person, but I'm okay with cats. Our dogs too nudge us to make better decisions. And those same artifacts could also be common ground for Americans and others who might otherwise disagree with each other on social and political issues. So 2 parts here that I wanted for the rest of the lecture. Part 1, music, sports, movies, and other cultural artifacts have a psychophysiological impact on our cognitive orientation so that we view situations differently, and we make decisions about them differently, because the cognitive mindset can differ if your mindset is us versus them as opposed to joyful. And there's 4 other categories that I'll go along with that. And that the same cultural artifacts offer common grounds for people who otherwise might disagree with each other, and be a good opportunity for us to be able to find common ground with each other, even amidst all the cultural differences and political differences that we have today. So I do some riffs and cuts and some pre-existing literature that is out there. One in terms of moral psychology. Very famously, what is it, about 40 years ago, Lawrence Kohlberg did his 6 stages of moral development, which was criticized, and rightly so on some aspects, but it's not a bad template, though I don't like the hierarchical sequential progression that he goes, that you start off at this very low level and you achieve this very high level. I'm not sure anybody ever gets there, and I'm not sure anybody who thinks that they're going to get at this pure level of always doing the good thing doesn't also have moments in kind of the troubling level as well. So I play around with them, but he has the pre-conventional where you are ethical because you stay out of trouble, the conventional because you want to build relationships, and the post-conventional where you're just doing the good thing for the right thing. So I like that, but without the hierarchical dimension to it. And I'm going to tell you how I use a cultural artifact in order to be able to relate those to students and others. Then there's another dimension that I want to build on, and that's this mediated institution tie. I mean, natural law thinkers have talked for a long time about how we develop our moral character in so-called mediated institutions that are small enough so that we experience the consequences of our action. And famously here, 20, 30 years ago, some sociologists, Nisbet was one of them, talked about how we no longer have the bowling clubs, the church choirs, the community choirs, the Lions Club, the Elks Club, where people establish an identity beyond one singular identity. And if you've got multiple identities, it's not just that you're a Republican or a Democrat, but you also are in the same choir with that alto. That being with that multiple identity makes it a little bit harder to just be really angry with that person. Or at least if you're angry, that you realize that you have to conduct yourself with that person with some degree of civility. And so one of the arguments that I'm going to make here is I think that we need to have some new kinds of mediating institutions, which I'm calling cultural artifacts, that allow us to communicate with each other, even if one identity is at odds with the other. And where can this happen? Well, actually, I think that business is a pretty doggone good place for it to happen. Business actually has the experience of understanding, in part because it's global, in part because it has to appeal to markets, that they need to have diverse people in order to optimally work together. There is a payoff of getting people who are different to work together, a payoff in terms of market knowledge, a payoff in terms of organizational production. And so I think that business actually has an opportunity to bring people together, even if it's just to make money, to get people to bring people together in order to experience what it's like to work with somebody else. So these cultural artifacts that I'm talking about, wait a minute, make sure I got that. Yes. Oops, sorry. I'm arguing have the power to nudge and to bridge. Now I'm going to use music as an example here for just a couple of minutes, and then I'll have I think these concluding slides will fall into place pretty well. There's a wonderful philosopher at the University of Texas, Kathleen Higgins, who's written a lot on music and ethics. And she talks about the psychophysiological power, which is a word that I never heard of before, but isn't it a great word? Psychophysiological power. That music gets in our bones. It's not just something that you intellectually appreciate. It gets into our bones. It makes you move. I do a variation of this presentation. My wife is an addictions counselor here in Bloomington, and sometimes I talk to some of their groups of people who are in recovery. And they're very skeptical of me. Why wouldn't you be? They're very skeptical of what I have to say to them. And what I do is that I play my favorite songs, which you won't hear the songs themselves, but I'll tell you a little bit about them. Songs that put me in these different categories of psychological orientation. And when I start playing them, their hands are folded and they're kind of sitting really tight. And I play a song or two, and it may not even be a song that they like. The tastes of a 62-year-old are going to be maybe a little bit different than what they have. But after a while, they start nodding their head, and you can start seeing the hands start tapping. And you look a little down, and their foot's starting tapping. And one couple of them even gave up, and they started swaying a little bit. Music does something to our body. It has a deep impact on it. It's not just intellectual, it has something to do on our body. And I want to suggest other cultural artifacts may have that too, that this profound impact that it has on us is something that we ought to take seriously. It's biological in our bones. Now, I do think that it is a little bit flippant to say that music is universal. Well, different cultures have different understandings of music too. What's beautiful in one culture is not necessarily beautiful in the other. However, there is research that shows that infant-directed speech, what parents do with their children, is pretty universal. We all talk to our babies kind of in the same way. So there is kind of a tonal quality that is universal. There's also research that shows that our minds are so musical that we can take speech and put it into music. Diana Deutsch is a professor at the University of California, San Diego. And she's done this experiment, back in the old days when we had voice machines and stuff like that. And I believe that it was a mistake where the message got cut off. And the message kept being repeated. And the line that kept getting repeated was, somehow it behaves so strangely. Somehow it behaves so strangely. And if you listen to it enough time, and this has been shown in experiments with school children that they keep listening to it, it changes from just speech to somehow became so strangely, somehow behaves so strangely. It turns into music simply because it's repeated. Our brains are wired to create music, not just appreciate it, and our bones react to it. There's other psychological literature that's a little bit more controversial that suggests that a diatonic mode of music, it tends to produce more happiness. Temperley and Tan talked about a little bit of controversy on that because in some cultures they like minor keys or maybe Lydian mode or some other kinds of musical modes, but there's some research suggestive of that. And there's also research by brain theorists or neurologists who argue that while the brain changes anytime that we engage in music, that when we produce music, that it's even more profound. And then there's other literature within the music that talks about Daniel Levitin's sixth song, that all music, when it has lyrics associated with it, is about either one of these categories that I have on the screen: friendship, joy, comfort, knowledge, religion, and love. And of course, there's also work that has been done of the music of oppressed people, of how they use songs in order to be able to cohere together. And this is also, I would suggest, true with other kind of cultural artifacts as well. So with that in mind, let me give you two kind of snippets of what this kind of looks like. The first one is how music can be a nudge. Now, this is an assignment that I've given to over 1,000 students at this point, and I've got 7,000 responses, I guess. But if you think in terms of, this goes back to Kohlberg's modeling, that there are 7 ways for us to watch a sporting event that correlate with his 6 levels of moral development. I realize that there's a difference in numbers there. Us versus them, rules, golden rule, as good as it gets, perspective, transcendence, and movement. So what I've explained to the students is that there are sometimes you can watch a game simply to see who wins. That's all you care about, who wins. And if you've got a big rivalry, like Texas, Oklahoma, or Notre Dame, Michigan, that all you're interested in who wins the game. And us versus them can sometimes, it can be okay in terms of we all need to have a competitive moment at some time, and it's okay to have an us, it's okay to have a them, it's us versus them becomes a little bit of an issue. But I will then challenge the student of, look, if you want to be in a competitive mode in the workplace, because sometimes you do have to compete, pick a piece of music that would put you in that psychological state of mind. And for me, I would pick the old Rocky, bum, 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 the song. And so if I listen to that, I'm in more of a competitive mode. And I challenge them to that as well. Sometimes we need to have rules and discipline. Sometimes I'm kind of goofing off or being lackadaisical. And I think, Tim, you need to get down to it. You need to work. You need to have rules, right? You need to be disciplined. What would I want to listen to if I do that? How about something from the military academies? Anchors away, my boys. I mean, if you want to listen, think of a discipline, I mean, think of the Naval Academy or the Army or something like that. How about if I want to have a sense of the golden rule, which is sportsmanship in sports? There's a great example of a women's softball game in the Pacific Northwest. It happened several years ago. Won an ESPY award, where one of the players hit the ball over the fence. But when she rounded first base, she tripped and fell and broke her ankle. And so she couldn't continue around the bases. In order to score the home run, you have to hit all the bases. Her teammates asked the umpire, can we take her around the bases, help her around? The umpire says, no, there's a rule against helping your teammate. Whereupon the other team said, well, how about if we help her around the bases? The umpire said there's no rule against that. So they picked the person up and carried her around the bases. Her opponents did, to score the home run. I had, Aaron mentioned my work with some NFL players. I had a all-pro defensive end, 6'6", 280 pounds, who wrote the story about this. And when he handed it in, he was crying. He said, this is what sports is about. So you can look at sports of who wins. You can look at sports in terms of the discipline that is there and the rules that make up the game. You can look at it in terms of appreciating sportsmanship. And here I might think, I'll be there for you, friends. I'll stop singing now. I'm an old Glee clubber. What do I say? I have to sing sometimes. Or how about to appreciate the moment? What I call as good as it gets, or joy. For me, that's the Michigan game. I mean, I'm a Notre Dame grad. I taught at Michigan for 11 years. I know who I want to win, but I can go into that either stadium and just love everything. Love the stadium, love the bands playing, love the traditions. I can love the moment. And so if I want to have something that feels this is as good as it gets, I might listen to Happy. If I want to have a sense of perspective, like you're looking down on things from the blimp, again, I'm packing a lot of stuff into a short period of time, I might listen to Top of the World, either from Imagine Dragons or, if you're a little older, the Carpenters. If I want to have a sense of transcendence, going beyond myself, I'll go back to my classical roots with my mother as being the church organist and listen to the Hallelujah Chorus. And if I want to have a sense of movement among these, that at one part of the day I'm at one stage and another part I'm at another stage, I might listen to either 1960s rock group the Byrds, or the Torah, or the Old Testament. To everything there is a season and a time and purpose for everything under the sun. And my aim here with the students is, and again, I've got enough research that I can put this together, I think, pretty well. My aim with the students is that if you are not in the right state of mind that you need to be in order to make ethical decisions at work, come up with your own songs, your own playlist, and then play them to put you in the state of mind that you need to be in order to make the decision at that moment. So because I'm arguing that ethical business behavior, whether intentionally or not, leads to peace, because I think that either way it will lead to peace, a model that gives us tools through our cultural artifacts that gets us to that place is itself a way in which cultural artifacts end up helping us get it to more peaceful society. So that's one way, cultural artifact. Then the other way. And this is my last substantive slide. Cultural artifacts also can act as these mediating devices for us to find common ground where otherwise we might disagree. Now, I don't know if this is urban legend or not, but I figure I'm at Notre Dame right now, so I'm in a safe place to repeat the urban legend. It's one of those things, if it's not true, it should be. So there are stories that I remember hearing when I was an undergraduate in the 70s, that American POWs in the Vietnam War were unable to communicate with each other because they were in solitary confinement. They couldn't talk to each other, they couldn't see each other, they couldn't gather together, but they found that they all knew the same tune, and they would hum it to each other as a way to maintain solidarity. Music can connect us. Music can connect us, and I've done this with the students in terms of giving their playlist, and even if they don't like each other's songs, it makes a difference to them to hear what those songs are. One of my favorite examples goes to sports. 2020 was a tough year. It was for my family. We're a very politically diverse family. One of the lessons that I remember very well in my PhD was my professor was a guy named David Messick, who was also a main mentor and tutor to Anton Brunzel, who's the Gallo chair holder at the Mendoza School. Wonderful, wonderful professor. And one of the things that Dave used to say, and he was an experimental psychologist, is that the identities that we create, that we adhere to so well, are very fungible. We can create them on all kinds of different things and then be part of an us, a new part of an us. And the example that he used, which really resonated with me growing up in downstate Illinois, then living in Chicago for 10 years and being a big sports fan, was he said at one point during the day, you could be bitter enemies if you're from Chicago or downstate Illinois, fighting about all kinds of political appropriation for roads and highways. And then at the next moment, I'll be cheering for the Cubs, which was exactly true. And you know, after the election, one of the things that our family did was to talk about the Cubs. And I realized that that's kind of like, how's the weather conversation. There's something more than that. It's a reminder that we have identities that draw us together in spite of the things that otherwise might separate us. And my argument is that we need to recapture some of those mediating institutions. And I think these cultural artifacts are ways to do that. Film is another example in terms of storytelling. Food. I have a vlog that I do on this subject, and I interviewed the former Democratic leader of this Ohio State Senate, Capri Cafalo. And one of the things that she explicitly did was to use food, to serve food to members of both parties, just to get them to sit down and talk with each other. And she's written a cookbook that combines some of those recipes. Something as simple as food or cuisine. Pets, this is the last one I'll really spend much time on. Even religion. This is why I include pets in the title. I wrote a book years ago, that the only book I've never gotten published. And it was our wonderful Old English sheepdog died, Scooby. And my then 6-year-old asked the next day, "So Daddy, where does Scooby go?" I have a PhD in theology. I grew up on a farm. I have some thoughts about that. But I thought it'd be more interesting to do kind of a what do world religions have to say about what happens to a pet when it dies? And it was particularly important to me because my daughter's adopted from China, my older son is adopted from Ethiopia, and then we have our biological. So I kind of try to pay attention to, well, what would they say where they were born? And one of the things that I discovered, so I looked at all kinds of different spiritual traditions of what they say about what happens to a pet after it dies. And one of the things that was really interesting to me is that if today, most of the time, if you sat down with someone that you didn't know all that well, or even you somewhat well, and said, do you know what, pick a tradition, do you know what Hindus think happens to you in the afterlife? Well, you kind of step back. I mean, that's not polite conversation. We don't talk about things like that. But I've had the same conversation where I had the conversation starter, do you know what Hindus believe happens to a dog after it dies? And what I get is they lean forward, because it becomes a safe place for people to talk about things that are otherwise might differ. And so again, my argument is that I think that cultural artifacts, and here's a number of them: music, sports, film, food, poetry, literature, business, and law itself, although that requires a whole different lecture, and even our pets, not only can psychologically orient us to making good ethical decisions at work, which itself is a contribution to peace, but they can also provide common ground for people to establish multiple identities. So when they interact with each other, they at least do so civilly. And in doing so, they might find more common ground than they ever expected to find. With that, I will finish and I will turn it over to Kirsten for her response.
Great, thank you very much. Let me just get the screen going. Okay, so thank you, Tim, and thank you. This is a great opportunity to respond to Tim. I've known Tim since I was a PhD student, and I think I drove him to one of the airports when we would have conferences, which was one of the duties as a PhD student at Darden. And we would bring all these eminent scholars in to talk to us about business ethics, and the PhD students were in charge of driving them to the Charlottesville airport. So I met Tim there, and I think he even met my husband then at the same time. So I think it was a family affair for some reason. I don't know why. Anyway, it's great to have this opportunity to respond. And so I have some brief slides, and they're not as pretty as Tim, so you'll have to forgive me. And I only want to try to extend what Tim is saying to actually say that not just that there might be more going on with what he's saying than at first blush. There we go. So the two big key points that I took away, just as kind of foundational, were that cultural artifacts are often taken for granted and seen as almost background noise, and that they can often mistakenly be thought of as almost small talk. And what Tim is bringing to the table is one, that these cultural artifacts are important as they can kind of nudge us to make better decisions with the type of way that we're thinking about either kind of in tension or are we bringing out the best in one another is the idea of different type of sporting analogies and different types of game analogies. And then second, they can actually provide some sort of common ground. So when we think of people being in contentious situations or not thinking themselves as similar, things like pets or games or sports can provide a neutral common ground that it provides us a place to talk. And there's no better way to do this than business, because while people think of business as this other place, it's actually where the most of us spend the majority of our time. You know, we go to work and we work with other people, and it's not this other place. It's actually the place that people go to get to know one another. They actually come together in voluntary agreements and they do things together and they try to achieve something. Most people are going to work to achieve something else. And that this is a place where maybe cultural artifacts could be used. And I would add actually that they are being used. And I think what Tim is bringing to the point is that we need to be more thoughtful about it because we are actually using these cultural artifacts and perhaps in a more haphazard or non-thoughtful way, and that they could be actually used in a more positive way than they are right now, or being more thoughtful so that it's actually congruent with what your goal is at that time. And so I'm going to focus a little bit on this number one and number two is the two main points that he made around cultural artifacts. So number one, that these cultural artifacts are important as they can nudge us to make better decisions. This also means that they can nudge us to make bad decisions if we're not thoughtful about them. And so if we don't want to be in a really competitive situation or an us versus them, but we're constantly talking about Rocky, or we're doing things that are not team building, that are competitive against one another, and we're constantly talking about people as others, that is actually going to undermine any types of goals that we have of like working with people, that we're going to see them as kind of competitive others. And so this means that we need to be thoughtful as leaders or just within an organization about the metaphors and cultural artifacts that are being used at your work. So when we talk about different things, are we actually providing a mechanism to actually make better decisions? Is it Rocky themed, or is it kind of bringing out the best in one another idea of, you know, like when I was just watching a rowing regatta over the weekend where you're seeing like two ranked teams going against each other, and it does seem competitive, but there's this camaraderie across teams where you can tell that they are excited to race against each other, and the opportunity only comes so often to race, and they bring out the best in one another. And so one of the questions that we might ask leaders are, how can we ensure that the right messages are being communicated through the cultural artifacts that they are choosing, whether they think about it or not, and which are helpful for actually better decisions? So which ones should we be using, and how can we think of categories of making these decisions, and having leaders being more thoughtful about these decisions? And so the second point, which was cultural artifacts can help us see things in a certain way and provide common ground. Type of music played, artifacts that are spoken about, outside activities emphasized. And the one thing that I thought about was which cultural artifacts and which type of organization are you in? So are we talking about poker? Or are you talking about Magic the Gathering? Are you talking about the NFL? Or are you talking about Dungeons and Dragons? And as the owner of a child that is more into Magic the Gathering and Dungeons and Dragons as an engineer, you know, if you're running a group with a lot of computer science engineers, you might be talking about Magic the Gathering and poker and need to actually, or then poker and Dungeons and Dragons rather than the NFL. If you ask him, he doesn't know what that is and just thinks he just literally said one time that looks dangerous when we were watching football. And so to find common ground with him, it means like coming to his artifacts and trying to understand and think about things that are common with them. Are we talking about Serena Williams and Sedona Prince? Or are we talking about Michael Jordan? Like, so those types of cultural artifacts might be ways to actually build bridges, but we need to be thoughtful about what those are. And really, I think what Tim is pointing out, and this is what I took away from, I saw one of these talks from him, and this one here, is that really these cultural artifacts are really value laden, that they are can do good, and they can combine this common ground if we're really thoughtful about them, and they can be a powerful force for good. And but what responsibility do we have in promoting certain types of cultural artifacts, and that we can be familiar with the people that are around us, would better leaders kind of seek to understand the cultural artifacts that have meaning for their people? Because it might not be the one that is for them. It might be that their people actually have different cultural artifacts, and it's important for the leader to actually understand what those cultural artifacts are. And the extreme example I would give is if you're like, if you're like me and you didn't know Magic the Gathering, but it's super important to somebody in your organization, and if you worked at Google, it's super important to people at Google, then you would need to kind of understand what those cultural artifacts are. So this is just a summary from the very first slide that I showed, so it's not new. But just that this idea that what I think is really key for what he's saying is that these cultural artifacts are usually taken for granted and thought of as small talk. And that's a mistake, that they actually can do a lot of good in providing common ground and giving us a mechanism to talk about making better decisions. But the key would add that we need to be thoughtful about those and kind of to figure out how we choose those cultural artifacts and are kind of matching what we are trying to, our goal is, but also how we can reach common ground with the people that we're leading. And thank you very much. Thanks for the opportunity, Tim. I really enjoyed thinking about this.
That was great, Kirsten. I love that. I got to incorporate. I'll even promise to cite you on that. So I thought
oh, that's fine.
I thought that was great, and it was good to hear you present. Like Kirsten says, we've known each other for a long, long time, but we haven't seen each other probably in about 9 years or something like that at this point. So it was fun to hear you present. So Aaron is supposed to have a quick response, or we go to Q&A, or what's the?
You can respond for a few minutes. We have a couple of questions that have come in, but I think it's, why don't you take a few minutes to respond to her thoughts and her inquiries? That would be great. Yeah.
I loved that. I mean, I really did. And I think that one of the common things or common dividers of Kirsten's comments was the ambivalence of cultural artifacts. And one of the most important books that I ever read in my life was back at that time when I was wandering around seeing what the Kroc Institute was publishing these days, when I was at Michigan, but living in South Bend. And it was Scott Appleby's book, The Ambivalence of the Sacred. And because I just found that book powerful in the sense that, Scott looked at that religion is the source of so many wonderful humanitarian positive things, and also the originator or the perpetrator of all kinds of violence and horrible things. It's both. And that is applicable, because that theme comes up with every time that I've done any presentation on business or on cultural artifacts, that there is an ambivalence of all of this. And to me, one of the reasons, and I won't say that I embrace that, I recognize that. I recognize that music, there's a scene in Schindler's List where they're killing Jews on the floor down below while they're playing Bach on the piano on a higher floor. And that juxtaposition is just so nauseating, and so there's this ambivalence dimension to it. I'm going to assume, maybe I'm a bit too Dostoevskian in this, I'm going to assume that the bad stuff is always going to be there. I'm going to assume that there's going to be bad use made of cultural artifacts like music or sports to get to the darker side. One of the things I want to do is to make sure that people recognize that there is that lighter side too. There's that brighter side. And so while I recognize that these can be used for not so good things, I want to make sure that that's balanced, that there is a good thing. Now, how do you do that? Is exactly as, and so I want to give voice to that. I want to give voice for people to be able to express what they think is important. And one of the techniques that I've used with storytelling, just in doing business consulting, is that I will ask people to sit down, as a weekend retreat, to tell their stories of something that they saw ethical, just to let everybody hear what it has to say. And it makes a big difference in the culture. And it's the same thing with the students expressing their cultural artifacts in terms of the music. It makes a difference for everybody to have a voice there, so that we try to, as Kirsten rightly says, not get exclusionary in all of this. And then the final thing that I would say is that it also, there's a normative dimension to this. As Kirsten says, we have to be thoughtful about how we do this. And the picture that I want to paint is that if we can connect this to an unexpected payoff, that certain kinds of orientations and artifacts and views lead to a less violent world, to a safer world, that seems to me to be a strong argument to be able to say, and this is why we are going to choose them over the other. But that becomes a normative argument. But I think it's a normative argument much easier to make if people have experienced what a cultural artifact feels like. So I thought that was
no,
great.
I agree. The only thing I would just to completely extend it is that I actually don't. I agree with you. I don't think that people use them for ill. I think what your point that's so powerful is that we're not thoughtful about it.
Right.
Like I don't
Yeah.
think about it. Like we use
Right.
metaphors and talk about small talk without thinking about, is this the kind of small talk that someone else wants to hear? Does that make sense? Like, so
Yes, it does.
it reminds me of there's a philosophy of science author, Richard Rudner, that talks about the scientist as scientist makes value judgments. And his whole argument is that you're making these moral decisions, whether you think about them or not. If you don't, or if you're not thoughtful, it's ungoverned. And so you're doing it, if you imagine like someone elephant going through a china shop, like you're just throwing around cultural artifacts, not thinking about if you're connecting or not. And if you have similar minded people, then you're fine. But I was just thinking about the extreme of like you're a Google VP and you have a whole bunch of computer science engineers and they just blink twice when you say NFL. You know what I mean? And they're like, we don't play poker. You know what I mean? That we play Magic or something. So anyway, but I'll open it up to.
Well, and I think this is actually a really good lead into a collection of questions that have come in, and it really kind of relates to why should we leverage socio-cultural artifacts to improve revenues in a capitalist system? Sort of the business piece and the moral piece, and sort of your thoughts. Both of you, I would be interested in what you think on that.
So the way that's framed, that's an interesting way of framing it, and I can see why. I mean, why should we leverage these in order to produce more revenues? I would look at it as, how do we leverage these in order to have more harmonious workplaces, where people who otherwise might disagree or not know why, like Kirsten says, not know why they might be making a decision or what make to use to make of it. That to me, that's the bigger goal. I mean, think of it. I recognize that business does a lot of bad things, and in a certain way, I'm grateful for that, because Kirsten and I wouldn't have careers if businesses didn't stink a lot. And so, I mean, we were hired to help people, to tell business, you're doing bad stuff. So it is a little bit strange in some ways to have a business ethicist talking about all this good stuff that companies do when we spend a lot of time talking about the bad stuff. But so I'm not looking so much about the revenues as much as I have a more inclusive, a more harmonious, a more respectful kind of workplace. And I believe those workplaces actually will produce more revenue. But for me, that's an addition to the point. That's not what I'm looking at. I think that the workplace is this area where people can learn to engage with each other who otherwise might be strangers.
Kirsten, did you want to respond at all to that?
No, I would agree with Tim on that. I mean, the other revenues come with it, but usually organizations have some other goal in mind. This, allows us to make more cars. You know what I mean? Like, so they have some other goal. But if we're going to be together, how can we get along better and make better decisions? Like, given that we're together. So that question is more of like, should we be together? You know what I mean? Like, should we be in this organization? But I agree with Tim's answer.
So, and I think related to that is another big question I've seen is, how do you see these principles really applying that you in findings to businesses interacting with civil society? And I think this is a little bit you sort of talking about this, but like, how could you kind of extrapolate that out for some of our peace builders who may not be as entrenched in sort of corporations and business and sort of the ethics of business, but sort of a broader application for how these things would play out in civil society?
So I think that what this does, this kind of framing of what business can do in order to contribute to peace and the use of cultural artifacts, is it helps to create a language where we can actually talk with each other. Because without that, a conference that I did at Michigan early on, it was interesting. We had representatives from business, from government, and from civil society. And every single one of them said the role of peace is more importantly played by the other two sectors. Civil society said that about business and government about business. I mean, it was just, they're the ones that are going to do that. And we need to have a language of doing that. And sometimes that missing. Or giving you another example, at GW, I did a conference on religion, business, and peace, which I've also written on. And it was a book called Prophets with a PH, Prophets with an F, and Peace, Prophets, Prophets, and Peace, with Yale University Press. And when I was giving people to come in to talk, I would tell them that, I'm going to be, bringing in these people from another part of the world, civil society or business. And they all said, oh my God, not them. They're the ones who cause all the problems. The religious scholars said that about the business people. The business people talked about the religion. They're the ones who caused the violence because there was never any common language. And I think that what this framing does is allow us to see that there is a common language that we can have, both in terms of cultural artifacts and in what each society, each sector can do in order to promote peace, that they do have different roles in our world, but they are not hermetically sealed roles, and that we can actually have ways in order to interact with each other constructively.
Kirsten, did you have any thoughts on that?
No, that Tim's is right on that. I mean, and Tim's the kind of the expert on that area of working with civil society.
Great. So I think we have about a couple more minutes if there's any last minute questions that folks have. I mean, I think for me, what's really been really exciting about this conversation is finding these really interesting intersections, right, of business and ethics and peace studies, and about creating pathways for conversation, potential reconciliation. And so I just really valued the contributions that both of you have made. And this has been, tremendously enriching for me. So Tim, I don't know if you wanted to sort of make any concluding remarks. We're almost at the hour. So I want to close this out.
Yeah, I guess I just want, well, first of all, this was doggone good fun. This was a great time. I had a ball. I could keep going for a while, but I know we need to end, and I have to get my son to soccer practice anyway. But there was something in one of the earlier questions that I just want to make a brief comment on, of a capitalist society. I think that there is an argument that one can make of whether the economic system is the most conducive to producing peace. I think that that is a political economic argument that is worth engaging in. My point is, this is where we are. Given where we are, what can we do? And so the arguments that I have been making is premising that we are in this kind of a capitalist society. This then is what I think that we can do. But that is not to ignore, I think, a larger argument. That is, I mean, I have my views on that too, but I think that that's a worthy argument. And I don't want to preclude that argument or suggest that I don't think that that argument is not an important one. I think that that's an important one. And I just wanted to mention that.
Great. And I hope that this conversation of engaging across disciplines, particularly in spaces that traditionally I think the Kroc Institute hasn't done as much, with business and ethics, and the Mendoza School, will be a model for future engagement. And I look forward to continuing to collaborate with you, Tim, and with you, Kirsten. And thank you for taking time out on this gray, snowy day to be with us. All right. Thanks very much, all.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Bye. Good to see you, Tim.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye.